everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am going to be demystifying the New York Times bestseller list. I'm going to be dashing hopes and ruining dreams, or really just putting an end to some unfortunate gaslighting, and honestly, hopefully giving you some peace of mind. What I'm sharing with you today is one of those secrets that is not a secret in publishing, but a thing that is not as widely discussed as it probably should be. And that is the known fact that the New York Times bestseller list is not just a list of the best-selling books. It's not just about sales. There are so many other factors that go into something making the New York Times bestseller list, and some of them are mysterious, and some of them are deeply frustrating, and most of it isn't particularly fair. Essentially, the New York Times bestseller list is not really a meritocracy because, seriously, it's not just about who is selling the most number of books. So I'm going to be sharing some conventional wisdoms about how the New York Times bestseller list works, also some pure conjecture, because part of the problem is that some of it's very mysterious, and so we talk amongst ourselves in publishing as to how we think it works. And mostly what I really want to debunk for a lot of you is the double-edged sword of wanting to list, feelings when you don't list, or feelings when you do, and placing undue value on the idea of being a New York Times bestseller. Because once you understand how kind of nebulous and borderline unfair it is, I hope you have a healthier attitude about hitting or not hitting the list. And this, of course, is coming from me, Alexa Donne, an author who has not hit the New York Times bestseller list and never expected to, and probably never will. I just want to say that I know I've never hit the list, and that I promise I'm not unduly bitter. I legit have never expected to hit the list, but mostly because I've actually understand how the list works, and genuinely, I think once you have a better sense, you'll be vaguely frustrated, especially when you have friends who almost make it and don't. That is actually the worst. I do have friends who have almost but not quite made the list. And then of course I have friends who have made the list. I personally think it makes you feel better once you kind of understand how it works, though you'll never really understand how it works. Let's just jump right in. So the main thing to know that I've kind of covered is the New York Times bestseller list is a curated list. It is not purely based on sales. It is curated based on a number of factors, some known, some less known or unknown, that the staff at the New York Times, the editors at the New York Times, whoever manages the New York Times bestseller list, they have this alchemy that they put together to make the magical, elusive New York Times bestseller list. It is a known thing in the industry that the list is curated. This is not a shock to anyone who is in the publishing industry. It does tend to come as a shock to everyone outside of it because, by the title, the assumption is, oh, these are the best-selling books. No, it's not that simple. Every book that makes the list is, of course, selling a lot of copies. It's just not the only factor, and especially there's nuance in the positioning on the list. So to give you a real example that is heavily anonymized, 2 books come out the 3rd week of September, not the real week, and both books sell about 5,000 copies. Book A debuts at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and Book B is not on the list at all, not even 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th. And there are books on the list that sold only 2,000 copies or 3,000 copies. Book B is completely shut out of the list, even though Book A and Book B have more or less the same sales. This is something that has happened, continues to happen, and will happen in the future because position on the list, making the list at all, is not just about raw number of copies sold. So I want to talk about some of the important factors, known and unknown, so known and speculated, that go into making the list. Starting with the things that we know are factors in listing. Sales, of course, sales, though I've heard that it's not strictly sales. I've heard it's actually technically copies shipped. So the volume of books shipped to specific stores for sale. I've heard then conflicting reports of whether it's no, it really is the literal number of copies sold that week versus no, it's about copies shipped. So somewhere in the middle of that is your answer. But that said, we do know that number of copies shipped is important. Distribution numbers are important. And when a book has a particular print run and is having a certain number of copies go to stores, specific stores, which I'm going to talk about in a second, we do know that that makes a difference. You can tell when a book has a good shot at listing based on these things. The next factor that we know is that some bookstores or points of sale matter more than others. There are key reporting stores to the New York Times. So these are specific bookstores. Some are definitely known widely. Others are less known, at least to outsiders. I don't know what they all are, but the publishers definitely know. And those key reporting stores to the New York Times, the stock that they have, the buzz that they report, and the actual number of copies sold makes a big difference to the list. I mentioned buzz. So another thing that I have heard that happens is the New York Times will literally sometimes call key reporting stores, indie stores, and ask, what's buzzy? What's moving off the shelves? What are people buying? So the trusted opinions of key booksellers can make a difference to something listing. So it is possible for strong support from bookstores, specifically indie bookstores, to make a difference in a book listing. This is how we get a lot of really feel-good success stories of a book not necessarily having a ton of buzz, but developing buzz, doing incredibly well in week 1 of sales with buzz from bookstores, or sometimes it's week 2 that it lists. It is possible for the little book that could to make the New York Times bestseller list based on groundswell of support. But then there are a number of factors that are more speculative. We don't know for sure that these happen or how big of a difference that they make. But definitely I mentioned buzz already, there can be a prestige factor to titles that can make a difference in how likely they are to list. There's all sorts of other speculation that I'm too scared to share in a video, but the summary I want to give you is that there's all sorts of speculation behind the scenes that sometimes it's just down to how much the New York Times likes an author, and that there is all sorts of stuff that goes on there. The thing is, none of us can prove it, and no one wants to say any of that speculation out loud. Hi. Because honestly, it sounds catty, but at the same time, I can tell you that behind the scenes in publishing, we all talk about the list and why we think certain books listed, especially if you hear that it wasn't the strongest seller, but maybe it had the prestige or the indie store support. Sometimes it's super obvious that something sold 1 million copies, and other times it's just kind of like, you're pretty sure sales aren't the #1 contributing factor in something listing, but you can't quite put together concretely why it did. You're always happy for people listing, unless they're your mortal enemy, but we do talk behind the scenes about the composition of the list. We've also been talking a lot lately about how there's been very little movement on the list, but I'm going to talk about that later. Another thing that is definitely known in the industry, like it's known, we talk about it, is that certain publishers and imprints definitely game the list more than others, because you can game the list. Because of key reporting stores and copies shipped in conjunction with sales, I'm pretty sure, publishers that know exactly which stores are the key reporting stores and approximately how many copies need to be shipped to give something a really good go at the list. Also, there's just specific kinds of marketing and publicity they can do in the run-up to a release of a title that gives it a better chance of listing because of word of mouth and getting people to hand sell it in the store. There are certain imprints and publishers that really prioritize getting specific titles, usually lead titles, to list, and they have a complex set of factors and things that they can and do to push books to success on the list. And what ends up happening is that we know inside the industry that certain imprints and publishers go to get things on the list more than others. It's a priority to certain imprints and publishers more than others. And so your experience of how much your book is pushed to list can just differ depending on who is publishing you. So it's not always you and whether your book is worthy of listing and selling enough copies. It's just different strategy depending on the publisher and the imprint. And I say this so that no one out there blames themselves if they don't end up with the runaway bestseller, New York Times bestselling book, even though they tried their hardest, their publisher supported them, that they could have made it if. Sometimes, suckily, it is just out of your control, but also sometimes a book is lightning in a bottle and it just develops that groundswell of buzz and it lists because it ascends and a ton of people buy it. So it's really complicated, all the factors that go into the list, but these are things that are talked about behind the scenes in the industry. Which brings me to Lani Sarem. So Lani Sarem, aka Handbook for Mortals, was a whole thing about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, I think, where someone who came out of nowhere debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list with a book literally no one had ever heard of. And the whole thing exploded where we figured out that she had figured out how to game the list. And she did game the list. She basically ordered massive amounts of stock books from specific reporting bookstores. Like, she bought them herself. That's definitely one way to do it. Publishers don't do that, by the way. And she basically popped up as a data point and they put her at #1 on the list, clearly without checking anything. And within hours, people were on Twitter like, what is going on? Who is this person? We've never heard of this book. And they ended up correcting the problem. But it kind of blew the list wide open. And all of a sudden, people who weren't in the know before were like, wait, this means that the list can be gamed. Meanwhile, people like me are over here like, yeah, we knew this. I genuinely thought it was funny. I thought it was really, really funny that no one with a book basically beat us at our own game. She proved that it was possible, and we know it's possible, and it happens all the time. And so I found that whole thing amusing. I know I probably shouldn't, but I did. And actually, that's what made it far more acceptable and comfortable for us to talk about publicly, a little bit, publicly within measure, about the mystery of the list and what the list actually means. And it was the first time we did all talk about it. It clearly doesn't genuinely only mean that real consumers buy books in large volume. It's specific stores, it's stock, it's all sorts of things. Obviously, she didn't have buzz and all of that kind of stuff. She wasn't actually curated for the list, but she gamed the system on the stock and sales order side because it is definitely possible. And really, I think it dinged confidence in the list. And in some ways, I think that's a good thing. But to that end, a new kind of issue that we've been facing, and this is all in the YA world. I don't play in the worlds of adult bestsellers or anything like that. This is all young adult fiction. We've definitely noticed a phenomenon over the last year or so where there's just very little movement in the titles on the YA bestsellers list. It's the same 5 or 6 books. They kind of move in position, but very little comes in that's new. Almost no 2019 debuts, for example, have listed. That's made a lot of us speculate on the back end, like, are there new factors going into the list that we don't know about that are impacting the list? Maybe that they put in place to stop someone like Lani Sarem from taking advantage? It's possible. And honestly, to that end, like, This is when we get in purely into my opinion, but also my reassurances to you watching about the value that you place in the New York Times bestseller list. In a way, it almost feels like it's lost its value because we know that it's not just about sales and it's the same books over and over again. Very little movement, nothing new. By the way, this was a problem with the list, years and years ago, and then they recalculated the YA list to take off paperbacks and move series, and that was the first time in a long time we'd seen new things on the list. But the same thing has happened again where there's no movement. So I anticipate they're going to change the lists again, but also it's definitely impacted, at least internally in the industry, a lot of the confidence in the list. It's definitely interesting, and I can say that there have been a lot of conversations behind the scenes of like why there hasn't been a lot of movement on the list lately and whether we're looking at another shakeup for the list, because when you know that it's not just about sales, that there are other factors that go into listings, such as buzz, it's both kind of mystifying, but also a little bit demoralizing. So I want to talk about feelings in the New York Times. It definitely used to be easier as a young adult writer, as a writer in this space, to make the list partly because there used to be separate lists for hardcover and ebook. And when the ebook list still existed, you could list if there was like a sale for your book and you sold a bunch of copies in a short period of time. Now, it was done away with in part because people thought it was too easy to make the list by doing a big sale, which fair, but at the same time, it means that now all we have is the hardcover list and the series list, and the hardcover list has almost no movement to it. It's the same books over and over again, and you almost never see something new on the list, and when you do, it's lucky if it gets more than 1 week. And so the question becomes, well, maybe that's legitimately what's selling. I'm so curious because there are certain books on there like 5 Feet Apart, a tie-in book for it was packaged. They created the movie and the book at the same time, and I'm just like, who's reading it? Are you guys reading it? I haven't seen it on BookTube at all. It's one of those things where not a single breathing human you know is reading a book, but it's listing week after week, and so you just kind of scratch your head. Some books on the list make complete sense. You're like, ah, yes. Everyone's talking about that book. I know it sold a ton of copies. I'm so happy that that book listed. And you feel that way about most of the books, but some of the books, it's just like, her? I mean, that's how Lani Sarem got caught. We were all like, who? But I think that there's less and less value in the list because it is so opaque. It's not actually clear how things make the list, and it varies so widely. I've heard about books listing at 900 copies sold, and I've heard about books listing at 4,000 to 5,000 copies sold to like make those lower spots on the list. It depends on the time of year, and it's just kind of like, and as I said, there are cases where someone you know makes it with X number and someone you know with X number doesn't make it, and you're just kind of like, what does it even mean? But what I want to leave you with is not to pin your hopes and dreams and aspirations on listing. Now, I do want to admit the double-edged sword. Does listing matter? Yeah, it does. It both does and it doesn't. Listing can make a huge difference for a book. Listing, even just once, but it's usually listing for more than 1 week is what really makes a difference to a book. It can create a momentum that legit turns it into a runaway bestseller. Listing just 1 week and being able to say something's a New York Times bestseller, it can be a game changer, but just as often you'll hear people caution you that you can be a one-time New York Times bestseller and not become like a mega famous bestselling author. But it does or can certainly make a difference. It is certainly a mark of prestige, but at the same time, because there are factors that are out of your control, and it's not just raw about sales, but also a book can be successful without selling that many copies. It can just be really dangerous to be like, I won't feel I am valid or worthy or successful unless I'm a New York Times bestseller. Just in this climate where it's almost impossible to become one, especially if you're comparing yourself to older writers, not literally in age, but writers who have been around longer. Because as I mentioned, it used to be easier to list on the ebook list. There are a ton of people who get to say that they're a New York Times bestselling author, and it means they sold 3,000 ebooks at $2.99 4 years ago. So take it with a grain of salt. But I just seen so many people get so disappointed and devastated because they don't make the list. I think the safest thing to do is never expect to make the list, never make it a goal, because it's something that's so far out of your control. And then if you do list, it's just a great thing that happened. That's the thing. Anyone who does list should be incredibly proud of themselves. It does mean that you've sold a lot of books, by the way. It just means that that's not necessarily the only factor in you making the list. So someone who does make the list should be happy and proud, but the flip of that is that if you don't hate yourself, don't beat yourself up, don't think that you're not as good as someone else. And if you have made the list, or you're just an outsider who thinks that the list is the end all be all, don't think that the list hitter is better than the non-list hitter. I just think that those kinds of value judgments are really dangerous when it comes to the New York Times bestseller list because of some of the bullshit that goes on and what it means and what it also doesn't mean. I hope I haven't blown too many minds. As I mentioned, most of this is pretty well understood in the industry. We talk about it all the time behind the scenes. It's definitely a complicated thing. Let me know down below in the comments, what do you think? Have you long suspected this about the list? Are you just like totally shocked? And give this video a thumbs up if you like it. I will make more discussion style videos about topics in writing and publishing. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.